Well, I think particularly those wanting to go into the criminal justice system, whether it's a defense attorney or as a prosecutor, we have again, and I love this country and I love our justice system because, as I said earlier, we have the best, I think, the best justice system in the world. It's not perfect, but I think it's the best. And people who are thinking about going to law school need to think about the reasons why they're doing it. Some people say, well, because I want to make a lot of money. Okay, great. That's, we all want to make a lot of money, right? But really, is it in your heart? Is it in your gut? I mean, are you going to love what you do? My daughter, for example, wants to go to law school. She's actually studying for the LSAT now. And, what I tell her is make sure that it is a passion. It's a fire that's burning in your stomach. And, the money, the financial part of it, hey, that's great if you're able to achieve that financial success. The important thing is loving what you do. And if you go into, for example, prosecution, make sure you are the best prosecutor you can be. I know a lot of prosecutors I litigated against who are now defense attorneys, and we do cases together. And so, yes, you can, a lot of back and forth, but the most important thing is your fidelity to justice and your fidelity to doing the right thing. And if you're a prosecutor, as I mentioned earlier, being completely transparent, being completely honest. And sometimes that means, not winning a case.
That's Erlinda Ocampo Johnson, the attorney serving as a prosecutor who resigned from the Alec Baldwin trial over ethical concerns. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Erlinda Ocampo Johnson is an attorney based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who took a special appointment to serve as the prosecutor on the Alec Baldwin trial. Erlinda resigned in the middle of the trial against Baldwin, the actor who was being tried on involuntary manslaughter charges. The charges stemmed from an incident on the set of the movie Rust, where Baldwin was an executive producer and an actor. In that incident, while rehearsing inside a church set on a ranch outside Santa Fe, a gun that Baldwin was holding discharged, killing the film's director of photography, Helena Hutchins, and wounding its director, Joel Souza. Johnson opened the trial by telling jurors that Baldwin was reckless in pointing his gun at people, putting his finger on the trigger when he was not supposed to, and violating multiple gun safety rules that ultimately led to the death of Hutchins. The defense argued in their opening statement that Baldwin had committed no crime, that as an actor, he was not required to check the gun because he relied on professionals to ensure it was safe, including that it was not loaded with a live round. The set's property key assistant and armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, who was responsible for checking the weapon, was convicted of one count of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months in prison prior to the Baldwin trial beginning. David Halls, who handed the weapon to Baldwin, pleaded no contest to a charge of negligent use of a deadly weapon for saying it was a cold gun before giving it to the actor. Halls was sentenced to 6 months of probation. The case against Baldwin started and stopped in fits and starts before it finally went to trial in July 2024. 2 days after the jurors were sworn in and the legal concept of jeopardy attached, Baldwin's defense attorneys filed a motion to dismiss the case over allegations that prosecutors hid evidence regarding the source of the bullets loaded into the gun. A set of bullets had been submitted to authorities with a witness claiming the bullets were related to the Rust case, but the evidence was filed under a different case number, and the defense was not informed of the existence of the evidence. When Kara Morrissey, the lead prosecutor in the case, made the decision to fight the motion to dismiss, Erlinda says she resigned and refused to move forward with the case because she felt the charges should have been dismissed at that point, which, because of that doctrine of double jeopardy, would have likely meant Baldwin could not be retried. Morrissey argued that the disputed ammunition was not linked to the case or hidden from Baldwin's lawyers, saying there was no evidence that it was related to Rust. Judge Mary Somer agreed with Erlinda, the next day dismissing the case with prejudice, which meant Baldwin could not be retried. The judge also said there were no steps she could take to cure the fundamental unfairness of the evidence being withheld. Erlinda still says she believes in the case against Baldwin, but the right thing to do was to drop the charges. Erlinda's choice, she has said, was informed by her belief that a prosecutor's duty is to justice, not to winning. In her own experience being born in Nicaragua, a country whose judicial system, human rights organizations say, has been co-opted and led to unfair trials of people merely because they were considered critical of the government, also informed her decision. Erlinda's family sought asylum in the United States during the height of the Nicaraguan Civil War in 1979. Eventually, her family settled down in Santa Fe, where she pursued her dream of success. She graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's degree in economics in 1992, and then the University of New Mexico School of Law in 1995. She served as an assistant district attorney in Santa Fe, an assistant United States attorney for the District of New Mexico, an instructor for the U.S. Department of Justice who trained law enforcement and prosecutors across Latin America. And now she has her own private practice, which she started in 2006 and still runs today. Today, we're going to talk about the role of lawyers in the legal system, the obligations of prosecutors to justice as opposed to winning, and how coming to the United States as an immigrant from a country with a very different justice system informs the way that Erlinda looks at the law, the legal system, and what the role of attorneys are in preserving them. So, Erlinda, I wanted to just thank you for joining me. As I had mentioned before, I first came across you when you were being interviewed on the Prosecutors podcast with Brett and Alice. And I was just really, I think I was impressed. I was very interested in your background and your story, but I was really impressed by the idea that in this day and age, there's so few instances where people are demonstrating the level of courage I think that it takes to walk away in a moment like that. And I was just really impressed. And I thought it was just a great example for all of us. You know, there are inevitably probably good and bad consequences to all the decisions that we make. But I thought it took a lot of courage, and I was impressed by that. So
thank you, Jason. I appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much. And it was not an easy decision because obviously I had to do it without consulting anybody, without really taking the time to reflect. To me, it just seemed like the right thing to do at the time.
Yeah, because you had in that situation as a special prosecutor, it's not like you had an ethics officer like you might at the Department of Justice to go talk to, or I'm guessing long established policies that protect people. Can I ask you, how did you make the decision in the moment? Did it take time for you, or was it something? How did that decision just come about for you?
You know, it developed throughout the morning. After I learned, so it started Thursday afternoon on July 11th with the lead defense counsel cross-examining the crime scene technician, and then learning that evening what these rounds were about and where they came from. And I was told they have nothing to do. They don't look anything like the ones from the set of Rust. So that evening I thought, okay, this is possibly just a distraction. Then on Friday morning, on July 12th, when the judge ordered that the rounds be removed from the evidence bag, and 3 of them were identical to the ones from the set of Rust, I thought, oh no, wait a minute. This is a problem because we as prosecutors don't get to decide what the defense is going to be. We may say, and this is a problem, I think, throughout the United States, where prosecutors are deciding what is material to the defense and what is not. Because the individuals who are tasked with deciding what is Brady are the prosecutors. And I think there needs to be a restructuring and a revamping of that law, because I don't think it should be left up to prosecutors to make that decision. But for me, when I saw that and I started doing some research and we're in the middle of trial, I thought, wait a minute, I think that I could see how the defense, so I put on my defense attorney hat and I thought, oh, I could see how the defense would use these rounds and would use this evidence in their defense. And I could see how then they are material, that there was sabotage on the set, that it was not Hannah Gutierrez Reed who was negligent, it was some other individual. Whether that would have worked, probably not.
Mm-hmm. But it was at least an avenue that you thought they should have at least had that evidence to be able to even pursue that.
Exactly. So that was not the issue. I don't think prosecutors, and I think that was the mistake the lead special prosecutor made, was deciding well, that's not material, that's not relevant, it doesn't matter, you disclose it. And so when I broached the subject with her over the lunch hour, and I said, I think the state should just go back and move to dismiss on its own motion. And that was rejected. She rejected that. And so then it was time to go back to court after the lunch hour. And I was not feeling good about moving forward with a hearing where I didn't believe in the arguments that were going to be propounded by the prosecution. Because
if she had made that dismissal on the state's own motion, jeopardy had already attached, so it still would have ended up being with prejudice, and there wouldn't have been the opportunity for a retrial.
Exactly. Jeopardy, it would have been over. It's over. And sometimes as prosecutors, you have to make those decisions. It may mean dismissing the case of your career, but it doesn't matter who it is.
Yeah.
You
and
have to make the right decision.
When you mentioned Brady, you're talking about Brady versus Maryland, the Supreme Court decision that sort of said, and let me know if I get this wrong, but this is just my memory of it, that basically the due process clause in the Constitution says that, like, there's an obligation of the prosecution to turn over, like, significant evidence to the defendant, and, you know, exculpatory evidence that could lead to different theories. But one of the real challenges, it sounds like you're getting at with that approach, is that it's still the prosecution deciding what you have access to, and you can't even really make an argument to a judge about whether it makes sense or whether something should be included as evidence at trial if you don't know about it at all.
And that's exactly right. You got it right. I mean, evidence, the prosecution has an obligation under the due process clause, as you mentioned, to disclose to the defense material evidence that may lead to a different result, evidence that could be used for impeachment, for cross-examination, and maybe discrediting a witness's testimony, which is what the defense argued in the Baldwin case, and that the prosecution withheld that evidence. And the good faith or bad faith of the prosecution is irrelevant. Courts don't look at that. And I know that is one of the arguments that lead Special Prosecutor Morrissey had argued was, I didn't do, this was not intentional. And that could very well be the case. I'm not going to argue that she did it intentionally. I don't think she did, but it doesn't matter, because Brady doesn't look at the good faith or bad faith of the prosecution. It looks at whether the evidence was withheld, was it material, and I think those boxes were checked, in my opinion.
Right.
And I think that should have been the decision.
And so, yeah, you recognize probably you were making a big ask at that moment of her, from her perspective, but you really felt like it was the right, the just, the fair thing to do. It kind of leads into a question for me. Like, I think that a lot of people have the perception of, prosecutors and defense attorneys being on these polar opposite sides fighting for their side, the prosecution on one side, the defense on the other side, but not thinking about one of the things that I've realized recently, or not recently. I think I've known it in the back of my head, but I probably thought about it more, that a prosecutor really has an obligation to justice that doesn't just mean getting a conviction. Could you talk to me a little bit about a prosecutor's obligation?
And that's exactly right. In fact, the American Bar Association, one of the first sentences on when you look up their website as it relates to prosecutorial duties, is a prosecutor has the primordial duty of a prosecutor is to ensure justice is served. They are an advocate for their position, but their job is not to secure a conviction, is to ensure justice is served. And sometimes justice, as much as it may be distasteful for a prosecutor to dismiss a case that they strongly believe in, sometimes justice means dismissing a case.
There's this, it was really interesting. I was listening to an episode on this YouTube channel. It's called the Roundup True Crime with Mike. And he was interviewing a guest about a topic that I never thought I'd be listening to, but it was performance reviews for lawyers. And one of the really interesting things about the point that you're making right now is that I wonder whether our system really judges prosecutors based on their obligations to justice, or it really judges them on things like conviction rates and deals drop. Is there something you could imagine that when you think of prosecutors' offices or the Department of Justice, that they could do to incentivize that focus on justice?
Well, I think they need to be less statistic driven. I can tell you, having been an employee with the U.S. Department of Justice, they are so driven by statistics. Just look at the National Institute of Justice.
Right.
They have statistics on about everything.
Yes.
Based on, how many firearms offenses, are resulting convictions, how many resulting conviction after trial and resulting conviction after a plea. So I think the U.S. Department of Justice needs to take the lead on this and stop being so statistic driven, because that's how they award also money to the districts. So the District of Mexico is a border state. And so it's a border district. So the border district is going to get more money for more prosecutors and a bigger budget because of X, Y, or Z. So it depends also on their statistics on, let's say, gun convictions. And yes, guns are a problem, especially, well, not guns are a problem. People who should not be possessing firearms.
Firearms, right.
Problem. And using firearms in connection with crimes. I'm a big Second Amendment proponent and supporter, but at the same time, we have a problem with criminals using guns to commit crimes. So I understand that, there's a big push for that, but I think that sometimes prosecutors, particularly in management level, become too desensitized, I guess. Well, I don't think desensitized is the right word, but they just become so focused on, let's just, how many convictions do we have on, gun offenses?
Right. Instead of sort of like, did we do the right thing in these cases? That in a weird, or not a weird way, like ideally you would look at, in some cases, a conviction as the just outcome. And you could even look at dropping charges as a just outcome. But really, is there a way, like, just in thinking about it, focus on the just outcome? I'm curious about something on your end. You have such an interesting background. You came here as a immigrant. Lots of neat aspirations as you came in. What was it about life or your background or your experiences that out of all the professions you could have chosen, why law?
Well, several reasons. In the United States, we are blessed to have probably one of the best criminal justice systems in the world. It's not perfect, but I always say, the justice system is just as good and just as strong as the people who work in the justice system. If we have ethical people ensuring that there's transparency, then the justice system is going to work. And so, having come from a nation of my homeland, where it's the justice system is fragile. Just put it that way. It's very fragile. Um, I wanted to be in a field where it mattered, and I started out my career as a prosecutor because I wanted to make a difference. Because and I was a tough prosecutor, but one thing about me was I always gave the defense everything. Even if you were entitled to it or not, I didn't care. It was disclosed. Now, I wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't an easy prosecutor in terms of if it was a violent case, if it was a serious case, I was going to prosecute within my duties and what I was able to do, but I disclosed all the evidence, and then we would fight it out in court. And so that experience, having come from a system, and of course I was a child when we came to the United States, but being informed, my father wanted to be a lawyer, but his family couldn't afford to send him to law school. So he had to settle for a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics. And so he worked in the banking industry in my native country. And so he would talk about how it was so important to him, when I was growing up, I was so important to him to ensure, that there was justice, and it didn't matter if you could afford a lawyer or if you couldn't afford a lawyer. And back then, we're talking, in the 50s, when my father was going to college in the late 40s, early 50s, that there was this concept of, public defender system didn't exist, but he saw a lot of deficiencies even in the system back then in our native country, that he wanted to be a lawyer, but he couldn't do it. So that stayed in my heart. It stayed in my mind. And I thought, well, I'm in the land of opportunity, and I'm going to take advantage of that. And I want to be a lawyer because I want to make a difference. And that's why I went to law school.
Yeah. So it was that ability to have some kind of impact. I wonder, like, for your American-born colleagues who may not have been exposed to other justice systems. I mean, like, even thinking about my own experience in covering things, I wonder whether there's, like, on our end a little bit easier for us to get focus on things like the competition, or getting the best possible job, or whatever it is, and forgetting about the fundamental pieces of justice that are embedded in a prosecutor or even a defense attorney or a judge's job, because we don't know how bad it can get. If those
That's exactly right. I think that my American-born colleagues who have not experienced other justice systems like I have, or maybe other colleagues who have experienced other justice systems, don't realize how wonderful our system is. And I think that is why I believe prosecutors, for example, the U.S. Department of Justice, they take on cases, that they have the resources. There are strong cases. So why hide the ball? Give it all out and disclose it all to the defense, and let's fight it out in court. As a defense attorney, making the transition for me wasn't that hard, having been a prosecutor for over 11 years, because the way I see it is I'm actually defending the Constitution, and I'm keeping prosecutors honest.
Yeah.
Now, it's hard because, like you said, when they are the ones making the decisions about what we're entitled to have and what we shouldn't have, and then going to a judge, particularly in the federal system, saying, "Judge, there's been a violation here, but let me," we kind of are, I don't want to say speculating, but we're making our arguments. This is how I would have presented my case had I been, had this evidence been disclosed. So judges end up saying, and Brady motions are not that easy to win, especially in the federal system.
Well, one of the things, like, flipping that, you just got me thinking about something. there's kind of like the opposite that also happens. Like, you know, and I think this has been like, to me, actually a phenomenal idea. I remember in the news when I first heard about like conviction integrity units and going back and looking at all cases. I really, I was kind of lifted by the idea that prosecutors would go back and do it. But we also seem to have gotten to a point where, and this is the piece where, the judicial system is also a political system where there are, times where those are used very well. And that's a great example of, a prosecutor focused on justice. And then sometimes I feel like those have been used for sort of like purely political purposes, and it's not necessarily a just outcome. If you were sort of like a prosecutor sitting in an office looking at the chief prosecutor or the person who's running it, like what kinds of qualities would you want to see in that person in terms of what their focus or their values are?
On the qualities of the chief prosecutor or the line?
Or whoever, yeah, whoever's running the office or setting the tone.
I think first and foremost, you want to make sure you don't have somebody who has greater political aspirations, because sometimes these positions, particularly appointed positions or elected positions like district attorney, attorney general, U.S. attorney, a lot of times these individuals have greater political aspirations. You want somebody who wants to be there because they want to make a difference. And they are going to meet with their staff. They're going to meet with their line prosecutors. I will tell you, if I were in charge, I would gather my line prosecutors and I would tell them, number one, we are disclosing everything. Now, if it's a case where you want to protect confidential informants, there are ways to do it by redacting the information related to the confidential informants, but you disclose. You don't hide the ball, and you play fair. Sometimes, for example, I mean, and I keep making reference to the federal system because that's where I practice primarily. These federal sentences sometimes are pretty draconian.
Yeah.
And particularly for drug offenses. And yes, we have a very serious drug problem in this country. But I think, and that's a different conversation. But
or maybe it's the same because it's all about justice, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we need to look at different avenues. For example, drug court systems in the federal system. I think only New York, if I recall correctly, has a drug court system in the federal system. Very few districts do. That should be implemented, a drug court system. Weed out some of these addicts, and let's focus on the people who are causing the damage to our communities. And if you have a case, I've taken cases to trial as a defense attorney where my clients have been charged, let's say, with federal drug trafficking charges, and we have secured acquittals. Now, why was that? It's because we had prosecutors who were unwilling to work, even though the defendant was willing to negotiate. They were unwilling to work. And so they become so focused on winning and become very, I think, intransigent about their positions. And I think you have to be willing to revisit
compromise.
Compromise.
Yeah. I figure in any job, it's like that. One of the things in psychology we talk about, and it's certainly, I've seen it apply so many times in my life in different ways, is that the escalation of commitment heuristic. And so it's this idea that the more you escalate your commitment into something, a lot like writing a book or doing a movie, or, for example, prosecuting a case or investigating it, the harder it is to see what a bad idea it is. And I've always thought, like, when you're in an important job that has real impact on people's lives, and so thinking about a prosecutor either, doing the conviction integrity work or doing the other work, taking time to step back and evaluate, like, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Is this just? Is this, is the outcome going to be just even?
Right.
Because, yeah, I think there's probably a reason. And I remember when it was the craze to have like sentencing guidelines that were very firm, and we've kind of pulled away from that idea. And one of the beauties of pulling away from it again is you have an opportunity to be more just.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
The sun's shining, birds are singing, and all feels right in the world.
Until the season changes, and suddenly you lose your motivation to get out of bed. In fact, 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the season or time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all, because we want you to live your best life and be your best you all year round.
Please visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
And that doesn't always mean being easier on people. Sometimes it means being harder on people.
Right.
But it gives
That is
you,
absolutely true.
yeah, right. It gives you that peace, because I think about it sometimes, and we spend a lot of time, and with your work, I'm sure you have a great respect for the Fifth Amendment, for the Sixth Amendment, for all of the rights that are in it. And I think we spend a lot of time thinking about those rights, but not thinking about the fact that the 17th word in the Constitution is justice. And it doesn't just mean conviction, but it means really, and it's actually the first thing before domestic tranquility, before any of these other things that are enumerated. The first word is justice. And justice is so important to a society being able to function. And it doesn't just mean conviction. It means fair and just outcomes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I see what you're saying in terms of like thinking about our system. There really are some nice things about it, but also to your point, it's only going to be as good as the people who have been handed the power to do it.
That's right. There's a lot of abuse of power too. So, we have to, and that's why, we have these checks, and sometimes it goes undetected.
One of the things too, I was going to ask you about is why'd you do it? Because, you have your own law firm, you're doing this federal work. What led you to, and what was the process like to become a special prosecutor on the Alec Baldwin trial? I followed a little bit, but not enough to even know why they needed special prosecutors as opposed to it being prosecuted locally. I'm just curious, I think primarily about like what your decision-making process was to even take the assignment.
So I've been practicing 28 years, and both as a state and federal prosecutor, and then as a defense attorney. And I was contacted about working as a special prosecutor on the case as co-counsel to the lead prosecutor. And I loved being a prosecutor. When I worked as a prosecutor, I enjoyed it. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity to go back and do what I did. And I thought, with my experience as a defense attorney, I think that I would approach it thinking, okay, with a more justice, not that I didn't before, but with a more justice oriented approach. And I thought, well, I'm at a point in my career where this is a nice change, kind of going back to my roots as a prosecutor, and then right, and then I read a little bit more about the case. I read some of the stuff that was filed in the court system, and I thought, this woman was killed. Let's not forget, a human being lost her life. a little boy lost his mother. And to me, that struck a chord. And I thought, well, I'll work on this because I want to do something different, do something that I used to love to do for over 11 years. And that's why I did it.
Yeah. And so as you sort of like started on the case, I imagine sort of like jumping back to what we were talking about before, that I imagine like preparing for trial involves like a lot of research, a lot of talking to your investigators, your witnesses, your lab people, getting your head around the evidence. What did you find when you really started to get around the evidence? Did you feel like there was a strong case?
So I joined the case kind of late in the process. I joined the case in, I think it was the third week in April. And so I was only on the case for about 2.5 months. And just on the Baldwin side, there was a ton, I want to say maybe 2 terabytes of discovery, meaning, evidence that the state had compiled, videos. And so they were also doing pretrial interviews in the Baldwin case when I joined. So I immediately started attending those. So in between attending pretrial interviews, I was reading some of the discovery, and I was trying to get up to speed. So I really didn't have an opportunity to actually, like we did when I was a federal prosecutor. You met with your agents and you talked about the case and you talked about the different investigative avenues. I didn't have that time with this case because it was so fast paced. And then right after pretrial interviews, the defense started filing motions and it was responding to motions. I spent so much of my time doing a lot of legal research and writing. So it was really, really, I was working probably 14-hour days trying to catch up. And so in retrospect, I probably would reconsider my decision given that there was just not enough time
to get there. One of the things that I was wondering about and thinking about, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but I'm not 100% sure I'm right about this, but do you believe that the case, throw out the Brady material and let's say it was disclosed, it had been disclosed. Do you feel like the case was justified? Do you still believe in the case?
I do. I really do. And that's why I joined the case. I do. I believe that there was reckless conduct on the set on the part of Mr. Baldwin. I do believe that, he violated some cardinal rules of firearm safety because let's not forget it was a real gun. And people say, well, it was a movie set. Nevertheless, regardless of whether it was a movie set, you treat a firearm as though it's always loaded.
Always loaded, yeah. Right.
And pointed at another person. And so, yes, I believed in the case. I think there were a lot of distractions in the case that were unnecessary distractions. The acrimony between lead prosecutor and defense counsel, that was unnecessary and that was a distraction. I think that, it's unfortunate that the case did not get to go to the jury because the jury may have acquitted, but at least I would have felt, hey, I did my job. We presented all the evidence to a jury. A jury disagreed. I respect the jury's decision. And so, yes, I do believe in the case, and I believed in the case then. And it's, a woman lost her life.
Right.
And it's tragic.
Yeah. Yeah. And it must be hard even from that perspective and thinking about it that, maybe you can get justice for her on some levels, or it was partial justice with the other convictions, but there's some element of it that you don't feel like you can get, I guess, full justice for her, if that makes sense.
I think the prosecution in this case did a disservice to her and her family, honestly. I do, because I think that there were too many distractions, too many personality issues, and things that didn't need to go the way they did. Just put it all out there. Give it all to the defense. What they want to do with it, we can argue about it in front of the judge and let the judge decide whether it comes in before the jury or it doesn't. But it's unfortunate the way things unfolded.
Yeah. And I, as you said that, like, I didn't realize she had a daughter, but like, there's this little kid out there in the world that, someday is going to look back on this and, you know, maybe not understand it as a kid or be angry when they get up about it. But I take your point that it's almost like a failure to the victim, to that little kid, to and frankly, even a failure beyond that, for all the people who look at prosecutions and stuff like that as, all the other people working on movie sets who could be affected, right? Because the production teams and other are going to pay more attention to it. And that's always like one of the things about justice that like I find super powerful is like when you talk about things like sentencing, right? And like what goes into sentencing. And like rehabilitation we talk about, and that's probably the hardest. You've got retribution, like punishment, you've got punishment, right? You've got incapacitation of people. There's some element of deterrence. And in these high profile cases, like a lot of cases, you're not going to get a deterrence effect because no one's going to know about it. But like these cases are an opportunity to actually have some deterrence. So I wonder if that's a missed opportunity too.
I think it was, especially in the movie industry. I mean, this was a set that was plagued with just mistake after mistake, negligence in the sense that, we had the staff or the crew being rushed, the armor being rushed to reload and let's do it fast. And so when you're dealing with real guns, I mean, these people work in an industry. I mean, we forget about the crew behind.
Right.
We forget, people just think about the actors and that's it. But we forget that there are people who go home every day. And there are people who go to their families in their regular, low profile lives that have to work in these environments. And so I think you're right. I think, Jason, it was a missed opportunity to affect some real changes in an industry that seems to be untouchable.
Yeah, on a lot of levels. And I think about this from my little exposure to that industry. Obviously, guns are an issue of safety, but there's like safety issues all around from like the way things are rigged or building sets or other stuff like that. And I think it probably is or it has been about time for the industry to think a little bit less about speed and more about safety and quality. And there's so many pressures on them right now pushing them in the opposite direction. Sometimes something like this can push them back toward that. One of the things that I was also wondering about, like in taking into context, we were talking about in the beginning, growing up and your parents having been in Nicaragua. What do you think would have happened like with a case like this in Nicaragua? Because like one part of me is like, would the famous actor even be charged? And then the other part of me is like, if for some reason the famous actor was not a big fan of the president, he would be charged and none of this Brady material would matter. What do you think would have happened if this case?
Oh my gosh, that's a loaded question because of so many different factors that go into that. But first of all, it's how much money do you have?
Right. Yes, right.
So
that
yeah,
Alec Baldwin can't buy his way out of our job.
Sadly, in systems where there is, not just, just in a lot of Latin American systems, they're fraught with corruption. And so it's, can you buy your way out of it? And are there ulterior motives behind a prosecution? And that's why, to me, it didn't matter who he was. I mean, I saw him across the table in the courtroom and he was just another human being to me. It wasn't, oh my God, there's Alec Baldwin, the actor. To me, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because I was raised to treat the housekeeper of the office building, the same way I treat a CEO or some high-ranking politician or a federal judge, or you treat them all the same and you look at them all the same because everybody has to work to make a living. We just have different professions. And so to me, it didn't matter who he was. And
It's
so,
funny you
yeah,
say that because I was just telling one of my colleagues who's new to the company, I was like, I have these high profile clients. It's not going to be the way you treat them that I'm going to know who you are. It's when we're going and getting lunch and we're ordering at Chipotle, and how you treat that person behind the counter is going to tell me way more about like who you are and your values.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I go back to my homeland sometimes, and I treat the people who work for my parents the same way I treat my colleagues. And, it's that respect, that fundamental respect that we forget about. And so, you know,
I wonder whether that's like part of what you're talking about, because I'm thinking as you're saying, like respect, like a fundamental respect for the rights of the defendant, a fundamental respect for the victim, a respect for justice. Like if you are looking at all of these things as something that affect human beings and we're looking at those human beings equally, like part of what prosecutors and defense attorneys are doing is bringing fairness and leveling the playing field ideally. um, and I'm beginning to see why, like your point earlier, avoid prosecutors who have big political ambitions because they may be disincentivized to look at everyone the same.
and that's true. And that's unfortunate. And, I've come across prosecutors, state and federal prosecutors who treat defense attorneys as criminals. They associate us with, oh, they're representing they're on the dark side, they're representing the criminal, they are criminals. And I've had prosecutors treat me that way. And I'm thinking, um you have no idea where I've been, what I've been. And it's the system cannot be this, you know we're enemies.
Hmm. Hmm.
We're representing different sides. That's true, but there's no reason for opposing counsel to not just respectfully disagree. And now there are some prosecutors who are wonderful, who are very respectful. They will disagree, but there's that degree. And that's one thing. If I were in charge, do not treat your opposing attorney, your opposing counsel as though they are criminals.
Mm. Yeah. And I feel like, certainly in some of the high profile cases, but even like lower profile cases that I've seen, uh, there's a certain element to theatrics, right? Where people are like playing this role. It feels like you're watching someone playing a role, um, instead of, like you're saying, like having respect for the idea that defense attorneys exist to protect the Constitution, prosecutors exist to ensure that the Constitution's goals are delivered on, and that we're all sort of like the judge too. We're all sort of like trying to serve justice on some levels, at least if you define justice sort of as the goals that we see in the Constitution. The for do you what Are there big misconceptions that you see people have about prosecutors or defense attorneys or even judges?
Misconception about what? I'm sorry?
About prosecutors or defense attorneys or judges that those of us in the lay world have?
Yes, I think that people look at first defense attorneys as evil. You know, um, I'm probably one of the most conservative defense attorneys. Politically, morally, I'm conservative, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to advocate zealously for my client. Now, I pick and choose the cases I take. There are certain types of cases that I will not take because for example, cases that involve child sex abuse or, abuse of a minor, I'm not going to take those cases. That's not
Yep.
some, but, I think that that's a big misconception because as I tell people, I'm defending the Constitution. I don't ask my clients, did you do it? I look at the evidence. I look at what evidence the prosecution has. I talk to my client about their goals of the case. Do you want to take this case to trial? And, so I think that's a big misconception
Yeah.
in the United States. The system needs defense attorneys. a big misconception about prosecutors is that people believe that prosecutors have to get convictions. That is their job. They have to secure convictions. And I think the public, I mean, having done what I did in the Baldwin case, you will not imagine how many nasty emails I received from people. In fact, one guy emailed me and said, "Too bad you were not on the other end of Baldwin's gun."
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, it was, you ran from the case as soon as things got hard. Too bad you weren't on the other end of Baldwin's gun. And, people don't realize that the prosecutor's job, as we've been talking, is not to secure a conviction at all costs. And so I think that's a misconception that the public has about prosecutors. Prosecutors are there to do justice. They are there to do the right thing. And sometimes justice does not look like a conviction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, judges, I think, judges try to be fair, but I think that there's also a political
element to it. Yep.
element to judges. Now, there are judges who are very fair, and most judges try to be fair. I think, in my opinion, most judges try to be fair. But I think that some can't help to be influenced by some of their
and I think
views.
Political views, our own, biases or we all get informed by that. I remember when I was a reporter, you grow up and you go to journalism school, you do all these things, and everybody talks to you about objectivity and fairness and blah, 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 blah. And when I got to my first real big newspaper job, my editor said, like, you're never, just by the nature of what story, just like you guys take cases, you're making a value judgment right there. And that value judgment is based on your experience. He said the real trick is to know what your biases are and know what they aren't and be able to counter them so you can get to some kind of fairness. And that was like life-changing great advice that applied well beyond. And I think there's an element to that in the law too. And what you said about defense attorneys was really interesting, because I thinking to myself about how many times it's the defense attorney convincing the client to do a plea. Where the defense attorney's like, they got this, you got this. This is what it's going to be like. This could be the sentence. If you plead, this could be the sentence. And that, the system, when it's working the right way, everybody plays all sorts of different roles that push toward justice.
That's exactly right.
Do you think that, though, in thinking about your role as a defense attorney and your role as a prosecutor, do you think as a prosecutor there is a sort of like special obligation toward justice in whatever form it comes? Like, because I'm just thinking to myself that to some extent, the defense attorney defends the Constitution, and that's a part of their role. And I think on some levels, prosecutors are doing something very similar. But their obligation is primarily to their client. And you guys seem to have the obligation to the public, the obligation to your office, but some kind of bigger obligation.
You're right. So defense attorney, so as a defense attorney, since I've worn both hats, as a defense attorney, your obligation is to your client. You have the obligation to be a zealous advocate for your client. You're not obligated to tell the prosecution what your defense is going to be. For example, I know that Miss Morrissey wants the judge to ask the defense how they learned about these Teskey rounds. Doesn't matter how they learned. The issue is the disclosure. The issue is that the prosecution failed to disclose those rounds, that report, since it was lodged under a different case number. So that is the defense attorney's, obviously, obligation. The prosecutor has a wider obligation. It's obligation to the public, obligation to the defendant.
Right.
And I think a lot of prosecutors forget that. They think about, well, my client is the public and I have to I have to go out there and get a conviction. And they forget that they have an obligation to that defendant. And
I saw a moment in court when I was in New York that was absolutely hilarious. And it wasn't federal, it was the Manhattan District Attorney's office. And, like it was just motions kind of hearings, and we were waiting for something on that big case. The prosecutor literally turns and says to the defense attorney, I think you meant to ask blah, 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 blah. And he was like, or it was she was feeding the defense attorney the right defense questions. And I later had interactions with her. I was like, why are you doing that? She was like, well, one, if he doesn't ask those questions, we're ripe for appeal. Two, my job is to make sure that there's justice, not to make sure that I win. And I was like,
That's exactly right.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
The changing of seasons can affect how you feel. 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all. Visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
The sun's shining, birds are singing, and all feels right in the world.
Until the season changes and suddenly you lose your motivation to get out of bed. In fact, 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the season or time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all, because we want you to live your best life and be your best you all year round.
Please visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
Yeah. And sometimes you're right. It has to be the prosecutor to say, oh, I think defense counsel needs to do X, Y, or Z. So yeah.
No, it makes complete sense. I was going to ask you, just kind of as a separate aside, so many people want to go to law school. They want to get into the legal profession. And I think, there's probably not like a one roadmap for all the different kinds of law that you could go into, but just thinking about something like criminal law and thinking about like what we were talking about, misconceptions too. What do you think somebody thinking about going into law should think about, and what they can do to prepare when they're considering it? Like, what do you, in both thinking about like their well-being and their fulfillment, but also having a strong justice system?
Well, I think particularly those wanting to go into the criminal justice system, whether it's a defense attorney or as a prosecutor, we have, again, and I love this country and I love our justice system because, as I said earlier, we have the best justice system in the world. It's not perfect, but I think it's the best. And people who are thinking about going to law school need to think about the reasons why they're doing it. Some people say, well, because I want to make a lot of money. Okay, great. That's, we all want to make a lot of money, right? But really, is it in your heart? Is it in your gut? I mean, are you going to love what you do? My daughter, for example, wants to go to law school. She's actually studying for the LSAT now. And, what I tell her is, make sure that it is a passion. It's a fire that's burning in your stomach. And, the money, the financial part of it, hey, that's great if you're able to achieve that financial success. The important thing is loving what you do. And if you go into, for example, prosecution, make sure you are the best prosecutor you can be. I have a former associate who worked for me who actually went to work as a prosecutor, who's working as a prosecutor now. And I told him, I said,
is there a lot of back and forth in the profession where people go back and forth?
Yes. Yeah.
Really? I didn't know
Yeah.
that. No idea.
Yes. I know a lot of prosecutors I litigated against who are now defense attorneys, and, we do cases together. And so, yes, you can, a lot of back and forth, but the most important thing is your fidelity to justice and your fidelity to doing the right thing. And if you're a prosecutor, as I mentioned earlier, being completely transparent, being completely honest. And sometimes that means, not winning a case. I had a case with actually prosecutor who's no longer a federal prosecutor. We were in the middle of a hearing, and it was a huge drug trafficking case at the federal level. And his witness, a law enforcement officer, essentially lied on the stand. I would not have known that, but he knew it. And he had emails to confirm that. And he approached the bench and he said, "Judge, I think my witness just perjured himself." And I was disappointed in the judge's reaction. I thought it would be a lot more visceral.
The problem.
And, she said, "Oh, I'm troubled." And but what he did next was exactly what prosecutors have to do. He moved to dismiss the case with prejudice, and he did.
Really? Wow.
He dismissed the case with prejudice.
Wow.
And I'm sure it was a difficult decision because it was a big case. It wasn't a high-profile case, but it was a significant case, and as far as
drug trafficking case, right?
right. And and I think you have to make those decisions. And as a prosecutor, that's so important. And we don't see prosecutors like that very often these days. And not to to criticize, there are some really good ones out there. And I'm not going to say that, they're all that way, but I think that is something that young people who are planning to go into the legal profession need to make sure that they are prepared. If you're going to be a prosecutor, you need to be always 100% honest.
It's interesting. So like to your point about like honesty and then focusing on justice and also caring about the defendant, like more of what I think I'm hearing from you than I may have expected. Because I think for a lot of people, you associate law with like ambition, right? But what I'm sort of hearing from you is like this association with law with altruism, with like making a difference, with caring, with about finding the just answers. Am I accurately reading that?
You are. I mean, obviously I want to make a living,
You have to, right?
I have to make a living, but at the same time, for example, when I was a prosecutor, since I went right from law school to working as a prosecutor, I didn't think about the defendant as an individual very often. Sometimes I had some defense attorneys tell me about, here are my client's circumstances and, but you don't think about that. And I think all prosecutors should be obligated to also work as defense attorneys at some point in their careers, because then you get to know the person. Now, there are some people who are just bad to the bone. I mean, people who commit crimes and, they need to be locked up. There are people who are just beyond, I think, redemption.
Yeah.
But not everybody in the criminal justice system is that way. The defendants, there are people who just find themselves in some very bad circumstances and do end up committing crimes,
It's interesting. So, you were on with Brett and Alice, and Brett will tell you that like one of my true hard things I deal with, my background, journalism, talking to people and finding out about their lives. And then also in psychology, we're constantly doing that. I've always struggled with that idea of there are some people in our society, like I get the idea of like incapacitation and keeping them away from us, that are beyond redemption. But I think over the years, it's become more apparent to me that there are some people who either by choice or whatever's going on with them just cannot be in society. How do you as a prosecutor know the difference?
I think it's not that easy of, I think that's where collaboration and working with your opposing counsel comes into play. I mean, I've represented some people who are really good people who just made really bad decisions based on circumstances, but they are fundamentally just good-hearted people. Now, I'm sure there are some very bad people. And I think as a prosecutor, you look at the circumstances of a crime, you look at the circumstances behind, you just don't look at, I think you have a bigger obligation to look at the whole picture. Who is this person? Some prosecutors tend to reach conclusions, this person's just bad, and because of this, that, or the other, but not really get to know who the person they're prosecuting. And maybe sometimes because of time constraints and caseload constraints, that's not possible.
So like it's that idea that you as the prosecutor can't necessarily go talk to the defendant once they retain counsel, but you can talk to the other counsel. You
Right,
can listen to what
exactly.
the counsel's saying about like who the person is and what they're that's an interesting it's an interesting element to it for me. Um is that like whether it's good or bad, like because I don't think humanity in this context, I don't mean necessarily humanity in the positive, but to be able to see the human that's behind in that chair as the defendant is powerful. So I was gonna oh yeah. So
No, I was going to say, and one of the bigger issues, and I'm sure you see it in your line of work, and one of your many hats,
yes.
is mental illness. There is
Yeah,
a
all of my hats.
so there's a lot of mental illness in our society in this country, and in fact, I comment this to my parents. I'm like, are there that many mentally ill people in Nicaragua now? We got different issues down there, but is it something just that's endemic of the United States? What is happening, or is it something that we just have become more aware of? But a lot of the defendants also suffer from mental illness.
Yeah, there's this book. It's really great if you haven't read it. It's by a journalist named Pete Early, and it's actually called Crazy. And the inspiration for it was his son Kevin, who is open about this, and it's somebody that I've met and lives in the I'm in the Northern Virginia area, and he lives there. But his son, ended up having serious mental health crisis that and led to like bipolar, or he had bipolar, led to him breaking into a house. Like the cops eventually got there. There was nobody else in the house at the time. And he's like having a bubble bath upstairs in the master bedroom, right? Like so Pete started looking at the mental health system because he, got the temporary detention order. They committed him. His son kept on getting in trouble, and the real threat was jail. They started to look into that part, and he's a former Washington Post reporter, so he's able to get access. And one of the things he was realizing is that like jails have turned into mental health wards where you have criminals and people who should be in psychiatric hospitals, and there's a little bit of crossover where you have people who should both be who are criminals and should be.
It's true.
Yeah, and it just seems like the wrong place over the long term for are mentally ill who aren't necessarily dangerous, because they're not going to come out better. And they're eventually.
They're not. And I think we forget about that as a society, that we have a good percentage of our prison population also suffers from mental illness. And when you examine their crimes, sometimes that mental illness was a big factor in the commission of the crime. And then you have psychosis induced by drug abuse, methamphetamine psychosis. And so people who would otherwise not commit a crime do it when they're suffering from some sort of drug-induced psychosis. So, you have to look at all those factors. I mean, that's not an excuse, but I think that is a factor.
Looking at it, we don't necessarily have the things in our system to do. I wonder whether there is, like, we were talking about drug courts before, and like drug courts can have like awesome impact. I've seen them locally. I've seen them like in my work really help turn around people's lives, like truly create the structure that allows them to turn around their lives. And I wonder whether there's like a mental health version of that we could even have. Like,
There is.
Okay. There are?
There is. There's in at least in New Mexico, in some of the state courts, we have mental health court.
Oh wow.
Yes.
How do those operate?
And they're similar to drug courts. And the defendants are sent to this program, and I'm not very familiar with the inner workings of the mental health courts, but the concept is similar to the drug court type program.
Kind of like compliance, and it gives them an opportunity to get treatment and get better, and then avoid the sort of black mark. I was having a conversation. I took a trip to Minnesota recently to visit the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe. And I was actually visiting the father of a young woman who went missing and who was murdered, an Indigenous woman. And he had been a guest and he had invited me out. And so I just decided to go up and take the trip. And one of the things we were talking about, because he's a first responder himself, he's an EMT in emergency medicine. He was saying, like, he was thinking about like the day he retires, he would love to have some people who are a part of his tribe who eventually could move into these roles, because the roles are so important for the not just the delivery of the service, but good role models and other stuff like that. He's saying, but the problem is that, you know, between like drugs and petty crimes, so many people get black marks so early, and some of it might be mental health related or other things like that. And I wonder whether, like, if we look at opportunities for some diversion earlier in people's lives from the criminal justice system, because as you probably know, once you're in, it's easier to stay in. Right?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, at the federal level, we do have a diversion program. It is not used nearly as much as it should be. Again, because I think you have statistic-driven prosecutors who need to make sure that they report to Main Justice that they had, you know, umpteenth, you know, thousands of convictions for these types of offenses. And, I think that more of these programs need to be used. I'm not saying don't send people to prison, because there are people who do deserve to go to prison.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I sort of think of our conversation, we've talked about some of the like beautiful things about the American system, despite its imperfection, and, you know, some of the struggles in other places. But like in thinking about places that don't have as good a justice system as us, and even thinking about our own justice system, like if you could wave a magic wand, like what would your hope for what justice would look like all around be?
Boy, that's a big one. You know, when you see Lady Justice blind with a blindfold, justice should be blind. It doesn't matter who you are, what walk of life you come from. I think that the evaluation about whether or not to prosecute a case. I remember I worked with a prosecutor, she has since passed, who absolutely would not offer the clients of a particular defense attorney a plea offer because she hated the defense attorney.
Whoa.
And so I think justice should be blind. I think that it doesn't matter who you are. I think we have to have the same programs available for any defendant.
Yeah.
I think that, and evaluating cases based on not who the defendant is, or, you know, looking at the whole picture. And I think that that's what we forget to do. And I think that's what the system, that's what makes, I think prosecutors try to do that in our system, but I think we need to try harder and not be so statistic driven. Because the sad end is that the bottom line, it comes down to money. So is my district going to get enough funding, enough of a budget? Am I going to be able to justify, you know, the budget I'm requesting?
But it sounds like sort of what you're saying is like the statistics are there, but they don't always correlate with justice.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. I totally appreciate it. And, you know, like I know you're coming off of a recent trip to Nicaragua and possibly a cold. When I went to Ireland, I managed to bring back COVID.
No.
Yeah,
so it's not COVID. I tested negative, so that's good. I just had it not too long ago, so
excellent. But yeah, I think your perspective, I think both informed by both being a defense attorney and a prosecutor, but also somebody who, you know, grew up on the knee of parents who had seen something very different, is an interesting one that I hope a lot of people get to hear your voice and hear what you have to say. But I'm going to ask this question, and there may not be a good answer. What's next for you?
I've gone back to obviously my caseload, my practice, and just going back to the practice of law and defending the Constitution and trying to be an advocate for my clients. And I don't know how much longer I'm going to do it. Probably not too much longer, but I've been doing this 28 years. I don't think I want to do it for more than 35, 33 years. That's probably a good run. I think that attorneys have a shelf life. So you don't want to, be doing this when your shelf life has expired. I think we all, at some point you have to learn, I think it's time to probably just retire, maybe write. I love to write.
Nice.
I've handled some pretty interesting cases I'd like to write, not about the Baldwin case. Gosh, no, I don't want to write about that. I want to, write about some of my other cases and, probably not, I would say fiction, but inspired by some of my cases. And so it's, and hope to see my daughter start her career. And, what I said to her is, learn from this lesson, this experience, that I just went through. And so, I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate you letting me share my story. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. Thank you.
Oh, it's an honor to have you on and hear your life and your story. It for me, even thinking about the way our system works and with all of its imperfections, it's just really humbling when you think about it, all the things that have to go into it. But you hit on a point in the beginning that I think is just so key, that the American justice system is only going to be as good as the people who are in it. And I want more people like you.
And let's just hope, prosecutors don't weaponize the system, because, that is something that is in vogue, I guess, when prosecutors weaponize the criminal justice system
for political ends.
Yeah, we have no justice. And so let's do the right thing as prosecutors and let's work together. Defense attorneys and prosecutors are not enemies. Right. We have different goals, clearly, but, we don't need to be at each other's throats. Now, I've had some pretty serious confrontations with prosecutors as a defense attorney. And it's all because, like you said, they become so entrenched in their position that it then just becomes a
commitment. Yeah. Makes it very difficult to get out of it. But I think that, if we could take a little bit more of the ambition out of it and a little bit more of the politics out of it and more of the altruism in it, I think we'd probably be in a good place. And you know what? Like, a lot of times I walk away from things about the law, like not having a lot of hope. And I'm going to give you this one. It's people like you who give me hope. And I genuinely mean that. Like, as somebody who is a reporter, and when you're a reporter, like, dog bites man is not a story, but man bites dog. So it's always the bad stuff, right? So, like, you get exposed constantly to, like, the corrupt cop or the really ambitious prosecutor or the dirty defense attorney, because otherwise you wouldn't be there, because if it weren't unusual. And, I remember saying to an attorney friend of mine, like, saying, I used to say I would never be on a jury because I don't trust cops, I don't trust prosecutors, and I don't trust defense attorneys. I don't trust anybody. And I think most defendants are guilty, right? So I'll never be on a jury.
You're the worst juror for both sides.
Right, exactly. Right, which would probably make me the perfect juror. But I said this to this friend, and I'll say it to you. It's people like you guys that give me faith and hope and restore my belief in justice and give me, and I genuinely mean that from the heart. I'm about to get teary-eyed about it, but
thank you. I appreciate that. Means a lot. Thank you, Jason.
So hang on, Erlinda. Bye, everybody who's over there in the chat that I've been neglecting. I apologize. And it'll just upload our recording. See you guys. Thanks for staying until the end. Before you go, I want to let you know about a true crime podcasting meetup we're going to be holding at the Hotel Ivy in downtown Minneapolis on Saturday, December 7th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We'll be doing a live show with some great true crime podcasts, have guests from the forensic science firm Othram and the Gabby Petito Foundation, advocates, and some fun events. We're also going to do a live investigation of an actual case. If you're interested, you can go to our Facebook page to find the event sign up or to www.silverliningshandbook.com to sign up there. There's no cost, and we hope to see you. If you'd like to join me and other listeners for more discussions, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us at our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. Joining our Patreon not only helps the podcast, but it also gives you an opportunity to get access to exclusive content. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.
This is the story of the one who, as a maintenance specialist for a historic high-rise, knows that vintage charm historically needs constant attention. Which is why, when it's time to upgrade turn-of-the-century mechanicals, they turn to Grainger. With easy access to 1 million-plus products and the scale to deliver when and where you need them, the right tools and supplies are never far away. So the one can keep that vintage building running like new. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
The changing of seasons can affect how you feel. 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all. Visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.
The sun's shining, birds are singing, and all feels right in the world.
Until the season changes, and suddenly you lose your motivation to get out of bed. In fact, 1 in 5 people experience some form of depression, no matter the season or time of year.
At the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, our vision is to build a mentally healthy nation for all, because we want you to live your best life and be your best you all year round.
Please visit mentallyhealthynation.org to learn more.